In this lab, we'll be looking at the skeletons of birds and mammals, both of which are quite highly specialised amniotes. In the case of birds, they're specialised for flight. So when we're looking at the skeletons of birds, consider how has this changed relative to the ancestors. So in the skeleton of the birds, we obviously have the skull, which has a beak that has a horny outer layer on it that will come off eventually after death. We have the S-shaped neck that's inherited from the dinosaurs and the rest of the body. The forelimb obviously is modified for flight. This is the wing of the bird. It has the same fundamental bones of the inner part of the wing, the humerus running from the shoulder to the elbow, the radius and the ulna being the larger of these bones. This is the one that the secondary feathers attach to, and then the hand. The hand has been highly modified. It's lost most of the fingers. We have the first bone, the Tarso Metatarsus, is here, and there's a digit at the top which is called the allular or the bastard wing, which raises a small set of feathers. So the wing is three parts with a wrist that can rotate and point backwards in a way that our wrists can't. The humerus attaches to the shoulder at the junction of the scapula, which runs along the ribs and is used to anchor the pectoral girdle in place. The coracoid, which runs to the sternum, and the furcula, which runs around the front. So the pectoral girdle as a whole consists of the sternum attached to the coracoid, which then attaches to the scapula and the furcula, with the humerus running off that. Skeleton carries on down the back and then eventually to the fused vertebrae and the pelvis, which is called the synsacrum of the birds. The pelvis still has its three parts: the ilium projecting forwards, the ischium at the back, and then the pubis running long and ventrally. The tail is much reduced compared to reptiles, and the end of it is fused into a pygostyle. This is where the feathers of the tail can be manipulated. The hind limb of the birds is three parts but modified. The femur is the first part of the leg. This is the same bone as in the other tetrapods. From that point on, it gets a little bit more complicated. The next section of the leg is called the Tibiotarsus. It has a fibula running along next to it, the small bone, but normally this would have been called a tibia, except that some of the bones of the feet, the tarsal bones, have been incorporated into the bottom of it. So technically this is called a Tibiotarsus because it has some tarsal bones. The birds stand on their toes. You can see the toes down here, which means that the bones, fused bones in this part of the leg, are actually also part of the foot. These are called the Tarso Metatarsus, and so we have a three-part leg going down to the toes. This is why when you see a bird, it looks as if the knee is going backwards. We don't see the upper leg, it's contained under the feathers, so what looks like the knee is technically the ankle of the bird rather than the knee. With the pectoral girdle, the only attachment of the pectoral girdle to the vertebral column is indirect. If you notice, the sternum is attached to these ventral ribs, that they are then attached to the main ribs coming down from the vertebral column. There is no direct connection between the shoulder girdle and the vertebral column. There is, of course, a direct connection between the pelvic girdle and the vertebral column in the synsacrum. If you recall the muscles of the pectoral girdle, they run along the ventral side of the sternum, which is here. The pectoralis major attaches at the front of the humerus here, and supracoracoideus came through the foramen triosium, past the coracoid, and then onto the top of the humerus. In this view, you'll also see the furcula, or the wishbone. This was the fused clavicles in the dinosaurs and the birds, which in some birds is large, thick and strong and inflexible, and serves to increase the surface area for attachment of muscles. In other birds, it is thinner and flexible and probably has a function of elastic recoil during flight. This Kiruru shows the difference in the structure and size of the furcula, which here is not attached directly to the sternum and is a very thin bone compared to the giant petrel that we just saw before. So when a Kiruru is flying, this bone probably is flexing with the beating of the wings, and is probably then providing some assistance through recoil. In the pelvic girdle of the Kiruru, you can see the pelvis itself fused with the vertebral column into a synsacrum, with the three parts, the ilium projecting forwards, the ischium, and the pubis being this thin bone coming down the back. In the pelvic girdle of the Kiruru, you can see the pelvis fused with the vertebral column, forming a synsacrum, the three parts of the pelvis being the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, and then the three-part leg, the femur, the Tibiotarsus, and the Tarso Metatarsus. Most birds have got 4 toes, 3 going forwards and 1 going backwards. Some birds have lost the hind toe, and a couple have only 2 toes remaining. Little penguin is an example of a very modified bird, modified for swimming. So the differences that you may see, apart from the stance, are the wing is now a very robust flipper. The scapula is broadened and very large, used to help affix the forelimb in place. And the leg looks rather different. We still have the same bones. We have a femur, Tibiotarsus, but the Tarso Metatarsus now is very short and sits effectively as part of the foot. So the foot looks very long, in part because the bones that otherwise on most birds are off the ground are here forming part of the foot. The bones of the forelimb are very flattened in the penguin. The radius and the ulna look nothing like the same bones in other birds. Likewise, the bones of the hand, the carpometacarpus, and the other digits are flattened and robust. In the kiwi, you can note a very reduced wing and pectoral girdle, a long and narrow pelvis with the tail curving around, and the three-part legs, the femur, Tibiotarsus, and quite a wide Tarso Metatarsus with forward projecting toes that are spread quite wide. With a closer view of the pectoral girdle of the kiwi, you'll see it has a sternum, but there is no keel on the sternum. This is because there are no flight muscles to attach to it, yet it still retains the scapula, the humerus, and the radius and ulna, and then the hand with just now a single claw on the end of it. These are non-functional wings in terms of locomotion, yet they haven't been lost entirely. Also note the incredibly strange, broad and flat, very skinny ribs forming the rib cage around here, which are quite unlike any of the ribs we see in the other specimens. The skulls of birds are quite fused in the area around the brain, which means you don't see the junctions between bones as clearly as in the reptiles or mammals. This gentoo penguin is a good example of a bird that we can see some bones of, but not all. The front part of the beak consists of a premaxilla at the front and a maxilla that runs along, that of course has no teeth, but otherwise the maxilla would be the tooth-bearing portion. Has a jugal bar that forms the arch running along towards the quadrate at the back. We can see a lacrimal bone in the front of the orbit. Around the top of the orbit, the marine birds generally have this big indentation for salt glands, which is very large in this penguin. And then the bones at the back in the skull we can identify mainly by region. Frontal bones at the top, parietal bones further back, squamosals on the outside, and then at the back above the vertebral column, the supraoccipital. Bones of some interest to us are those that articulate with the lower jaw and with the jugal arch. The quadrate that is in here forms the articulation point between the skull and the lower jaw. The articulation bones are different than in the mammals, but we still have the quadrate and articular. The lower jaw has a dentary bone at the front and then a range of other bones behind that. In this dorsal view of the gentoo penguin, we get a really clear view of the large indentations for the salt glands to sit in. If we look at the mechanism of jaw articulation, we see the quadrate bone running between the skull and the articular bone of the lower jaw. It also articulates with the jugal bar running along here. Now if we rotate the skull, we'll be able to see the next stage on the interior of the palate, which are these bones running up the middle. These two coming in from the sides are the pterygoid bones that are also connected to the quadrate. So as the quadrate moves, it will also put pressure on these pterygoids. The parasphenoid covers this area and runs up the middle, and the true palate bones, palatine bones, are either side of this groove down the front of the bill, which is obscured by the lower mandible. There's a very small bone in the neognath birds, the vomer, which is right in the middle here, and the paleognaths, this is a broad bone that pushes the palatine bones apart. So in this view, typical view of a neognathous bird, we have a quadrate articulating with the jugal, and we have a pterygoid coming into the center of the palate and abutting the palatine bones. In some birds, this is a flexible system with a hinge, and we will see some examples of that in a moment. This is a broad-billed prion, which is a plankton-straining small seabird. So we can see in this, again, the indentations around the orbit for the salt glands. We're going to rotate the skull and see some of the other features of it. Incredibly broad beak, of course, hence the name broad-billed prion. As we rotate it, we'll see coming into view the quadrate running between the skull and the jugal arch and the lower mandible. As we turn it further, we can get a really good view of the mechanisms on the underside of the skull. So we have the quadrates articulating with the lower jaw and also with the pterygoids running towards the center of the beak. This has got a huge pair of palate bones along here with the very skinny vomer tucked away right in the middle. They have a broad, thick tongue that spans the entire mouth that presses up, and they have a layer of baleen-like lamellae running along the side of the bill. So they take a mouthful of water, press the tongue up, strain the water out, and collect the krill that are trapped within here. The Australasian gannet is a diving bird that has two main modifications to its skull compared to other marine birds. The first is that there are no external nostrils. Normally we would see paired nostrils on the top of the beak. Gannets don't have these. They only breathe through their mouth, because otherwise they'd get water being forced into the skull every time they dived. The other thing is that the location of the salt glands is different. Instead of being behind the eye, they're actually at the back of the skull. Again, this is probably to reduce impacts on the soft tissues when they dive. If we rotate the skull, again, we can see a nice big quadrate down here, and the same bones of the underside of the skull, the pterygoids, and the palatine bones running along the underside of the skull. In this red crown kakariki skull, we see a really cool innovation. Many birds have a flexible hinge across the top of the skull, enabling the beak to move slightly independently of the rest of the skull. There's really neat functionality in this parakeet skull, whereby we see the jugal bar, the maxillojugal bar, running from the beak itself down to the quadrate. So as the quadrate rotates, this puts pressure on the beak to lift it up. But there's more than that, because if we rotate it further, we'll see the same thing happens with these pterygoids and the palatines that are also attached to the quadrate. So as the quadrate rotates, as the lower jaw comes down, the pterygoids and the palatines and the jugal bar all push the upper mandible open. So as a parrot opens its lower jaw, it automatically opens its upper jaw as well. So this is enabled by this flexible hinge between the beak and the rest of the skull, and the movement of the jugal bar and the pterygoid and the palatines. In this case, they are not fused to the bone running down the ventral side of the skull. The basisphenoid, they can slide up it. In the paleognathous birds, the palate structure differs. This is a kiwi skull. If we rotate the kiwi skull around, we can see the ventral side of it. So again, we have a quadrate tucked in here, articulating with the lower jaw, and the pterygoid here is a small bone that is fused with the palatine. So rather than the pterygoid providing a flexible hinge with the palatine, allowing some movement. This is now fused, and the vomer, that in the Neognathus birds is very small, is quite large and is pushing these palatines apart. The palatines are also fused with the maxilla, so there's very little flexibility in the palate of a Paleognathus bird. So we have the maxilla fused with the palatine, which is fused with the pterygoid that then articulates with the quadrate. A unique feature of the bill of the kiwi is the positioning of the nostrils. The nostrils on most birds are towards the top of the beak. In the kiwi, they are right down by the tip of the beak, enabling the bird to smell while it is probing in the ground. A main example of a mammal skull is a dog. This specimen has got the sutures inked so you can see the differences in the bones quite clearly. In the skull of the dog, we can see the premaxilla with teeth and most of the teeth on the maxilla. You can see the difference in form of the different teeth, heterodont dentition. Nasal bones running along the center of the skull, frontals between the eyes, a jugal forming the first part of the zygomatic arch. Behind the orbit, we have the large parietal bones on either side of the skull, a occipital crest at the back that forms an area for muscles to attach that go forwards to the jaw, and the bone forming the back of the zygomatic arch is the squamosal. The bone that we're missing in here is the quadrate and any form of quadratic jugal. The reason being the quadrate is now part of the inner ear, which is situated down here, and the squamosal now forms this. This is reflecting we have a squamosal dentary joint between the skull and the jaw rather than a quadrate articular joint. On the ventral surface of the skull, we can see again the premaxilla and the maxilla and the jugal arch around here. But there are some differences with the skulls that we've seen from other groups. We have incisive foramen at the front. This is the entrance to Jacobson's organ, the vomeronasal organ for smell. And we have a hard palate carrying down to the palatine bones here. The pterygoid bones, which were very important in articulation of the jaw in the birds, are now just part of the bones of the center of the skull, running along to the exit of the hard palate where it becomes a soft palate. So air can enter the nostrils at the front and then pass along the hard palate and then come out directly next to the trachea. We have these rounded tympanic bulla. This is the ears of the mammal. There are other small bones in here that you can see the junctions between. You can find them labelled in the text. On the lower jaw, note this is all now one single bone, the dentary. The bones that used to be posterior to the dentary have been lost. Some of those have been incorporated into the skull. In the domestic cat skull, we can observe the bones quite well also. Premaxilla and maxilla with teeth, the nasals, the frontals, the jugal forming the first part of the zygomatic arch, with the squamosal forming the posterior part of it, parietal in the back of the skull, and the occipital bones at the extreme posterior end. On the ventral side of the cat skull, again we can see the openings to the vomeronasal organ. We can see the maxilla, the palatine bones, the hard palate, and then the area where the soft palate would be. Vomer right in the middle, and the pterygoids are fused into the outside of this region. The large tympanic bullas or the internal ears. Koipu is a large rodent that we can see the entire skeleton of. Along the vertebral column, there are different regions. We start off with the atlas and axis vertebrae, the first two vertebrae of the vertebral column that allow the head to move up and down and sideways. The neck vertebrae are referred to as cervical, and the thoracic vertebrae are the neck section. These are the vertebrae that have the ribs attaching to them. The lumbar region of the spine is the lower back. These have large zygapophyses on them which restrict movement and twisting of that part of the body. The sacral vertebrae are those running along the pelvic girdle. They are fused into a synsacrum, less fused than in the birds, but nevertheless there is fusion of these vertebrae. Finally, the chordal vertebrae are those of the tail and are relatively simple and unelaborated. So in the forelimb, we can see a large vertically oriented scapula with a spine running down the middle, to which long muscles attach that come down to the forelimb. In the mammals, this is typically quite mobile, plays a different role than in the birds, and it serves to extend the movable part of the limb. The limb itself has two main portions, the humerus, the first one, and then the radius and the ulna coming down the lower part of the leg. The foot has carpals and metacarpals, and finally the phalanges or the toes. The forelimb may be attached to the vertebral column very indirectly, or it may have no direct connection to the vertebral column at all, but be held in place by a muscular sling. In mammals, the clavicle may connect from the shoulder to the sternum, or it may be absent in animals that run. So the only direct connections between the forelimb and the vertebral column are via the clavicle, then to the sternum, and then to any ribs. So it is very indirect connection between the pectoral girdle and the vertebral column. The pelvis of the mammal is fused with the vertebral column. It consists of three bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. The difference with the mammalian pelvis is that the pubic bones are fused on the ventral side, which means any young has to be born through a very small opening, unlike in the birds. The leg bones are familiar to us, the femur with a ball and socket joint, and then a tibia and fibula. In burrowing animals or digging ones, these may be quite separate and allow large rotation of the leg. The foot consists of the metatarsals and the phalanges. The mammals vary in whether they walk on their feet or their toes. In this example, it's walking on its toes and has quite a large calcaneum to which tendons from the lower leg can attach. Bats represent the third lineage of tetrapods to take to the skies, after the pterosaurs and the birds. Each group has done it in a different way. The bats have extended their forelimb by extending the length of these four fingers to then have webs of skin between them. So one modification is the extension of the hand. Another is in the way that the clavicle and the scapula just form an extension of the forelimb. So the scapula plays quite a different role here, and this has a very long flexible forelimb that can move in a different way to that of the birds. This is a young fur seal, a marine mammal, which has got modifications to both its forelimbs and its hind limbs. You can see in the forelimb there is no clavicle, there is no direct attachment between the forelimb and the vertebral column. We have a broad scapula, but a very short humerus, radius, and an ulna, and an extended hand. So the fingers are comparatively long relative to the earlier parts of the limb. Similarly, on the hind limb, we have very short leg bones, as it were, and very long, proportionally long foot bones. So modification of a mammal for marine life. Also lost the tail, flippers for the hind limbs, and flippers for the forelimbs. Compare this to the penguin and think about similarities in design for aquatic living. This is a camel. It's got big teeth.